Hello, my name is Eric, and today I'm going to start a project called Yard Defense. It is an incremental project. It's just a game that's kind of similar to any of those incremental games, Cookie Clicker, or maybe what else? Adventure Communists or Adventure Capitalists, any of those kind of things. They're pretty fun games. They involve kind of an idle gameplay aspect as well as an active gameplay aspect. But what's nice about them is they're a fairly good introduction to a lot of good practices in game development, not just Unity, but in particular Unity here. So I'm going to go over some of my patterns that I follow when I develop a game, and hopefully these can be helpful for you going forward. So I'm actually going to introduce something called controller data and info scripts. This is kind of how I organize my scripts in my project. This isn't a tried and true pattern that's known across the world as an architectural design pattern, but the idea behind what I do here is to separate the data of the game from the actual functionality. So if, say for example, I'm going to turn on this light because it's getting a little dark in here. Say for example, you have, you're playing, what's a game here? You're playing chess, and you can move a rook only in the horizontal or vertical direction. You can't move diagonally. Well, okay, that's a functionality component. You don't need to send that information to a server. You don't need that information to load up the game. You know that that's just a native functionality of the game. That's a controller aspect. Vertical and horizontal functionality, you don't need to worry about that as far as serializing it to a database or sending it up to a game server. However, where the rook sits on the actual board, it's on G5. That's something that's critical. If I were to leave the game and come back, I need to know that. That's an info-related script. So controllers are how the rook can move and what constrains it. And the info is where the rook physically sits. And maybe you want to store more information like what other pieces did the rook take, whose turn is it, what color is the rook, all that kind of stuff. But for the most part, the info is just what I need to come back to the game after I've left. And the controller is stuff that drives functionality that has nothing to do with the data. And then data is kind of a secondary layer. It's similar to info. However, data is typically not mono behaviors, so that's why I separate them into a third folder of those two. And what that does is allows me to take the game data, serialize it as a generic class in C#, and I can save it to SQLite or MySQL or MongoDB, depending on what I'm using for my serialization. And then managers is something altogether separately, and that's the first thing we're going to get into. It's the event manager. And that's something that's typically single instances. They're usually accessible via static reference. I typically avoid singletons. I do use static references, but I don't think singletons in Unity are as valuable as a lot of people advertise them to be. If you follow a data-driven design pattern, you shouldn't rely on singletons. You shouldn't have to rely on singletons as much, because the idea behind a data-driven design pattern is you should be able to just close a scene down completely and open up a new one with the data from the database and have no hiccups or anything like that. So let's get right into our event manager here. So this is an event manager. You'll notice right off the bat, I make sure I put everything in a namespace Eric Overflow. The reason I do that is if I want to prototype a new script or create a different script of the same exact name and try it out, I can do that with just a different namespace, and I don't have conflicting script names. But what this event manager does is this is supposed to provide the ability for other scripts to trigger events and send other notifications to other scripts without having to direct dependency on them. So right now, this isn't going to have anything in it. We're going to get pretty quickly into things, though. We're going to create two things. We're going to create a mob info, which is information about the mob. So we're going to create a script here called mob info. And then we're going to create a player info, which will be information about the dog or the character you're playing. For this game, it's about a dog that barks at things outside because it's inspired by my dogs back there who bark at everything and anything that makes a shadow on the windows. So, player info. What's some information about the player? Maybe the player has health. So we're going to call health. Maybe the player has attack damage. Maybe the player has attack speed. And let's just initialize all these values. This is 2 per second, so we know that for future. We'll make that 1, and we'll make it 100. Because it's an incremental game, maybe someone's just going to AFK for a little while. So what this information tells me is currently the player has 100 health, they have an attack damage of 1, and they have an attack speed of 2. Okay, pretty simple. Now, if we go over to the mob info, we can probably do something pretty similar. Let's actually just copy that in and look at that. Health, attack damage, attack speed. It looks like those two things share similar functionality. we could abstract that out. Do we really want to yet? Maybe not, because I suspect that that's going to be overkill. A lot of people will say, hey, these two share similar scripts or similar functionality, same fields. We should create an abstract class that they inherit from. You could do that, and it is a design pattern you could get into, so that if you ever were to try to change the way that health works, something like that, it would save you some time. However, and this is a big however, there's such a thing as oversimplifying. If I were to try to take mob info and player info and abstract them both into their own class and then have them both inherit or implement that class, I'm going to end up abstracting away a lot of that functionality, and it's going to be a little bit harder for me to develop, and it might not be as verbose. It's harder for me to go back to this project and pick up if I were to leave and come back a week later. So here, I'm not going to create a class that these both implement. We're just going to leave them both the same. Maybe we'll make our mob's health 10 and its attack speed 1, so it's a little bit weaker than our player. So right now, let's create our manager object. Spell it right. Let's create our player object. And let's create our enemy object. Alright, so in our scene, I'm going to go ahead and import some images so we have stuff to work with from a previous project. Documents, GitHub, yada yada, assets, imports. I have some very, very adorable art that some people have made for me. So we've got, oh, we don't need that. I've got 2 dog faces. My 2 dogs. And we're just going to import those, and we'll create a separate asset folder for that called imports, and we'll create a sprites folder in here. We'll move these, where did I put them in info? Silly me. What are you doing, Tiny? Don't tear up the bed. Come on. Killing me. Move them in there, and then we'll move them in here. Now we've got our sprites available. So let's say we've got our player. Our player needs to have a sprite render. Put Tiny in there. Move them right there. Maybe we'll make these at a 64 pixels per unit. Make it a little bigger. That's probably fine. That's an acceptable size. And then we'll do the same thing, only our enemy, we're going to make Tim for some reason. That's my other dog. His name is Tim. We're going to put him in there. Move him over here. We're going to scale him in the other direction so they look like they're facing each other. Okay, so we've got a player and we've got an enemy. Let's throw our mob info on Tim. Let's throw our oh wait, that was Tiny. Remove component. Let's throw our player info on him. Let's throw our mob info on him. And all of a sudden, we now have 2 scripts that have information about themselves. And so if one of them were to take damage, that other script should have that information. How do we make this, first of all, available to the inspector to read? And second of all, how do we actually make them damage each other? First, from an actual UI standpoint, typically this information isn't needed to be exposed to the inspector because it should be initialized from data or scriptable objects. But for right now, we can maybe set these as serializable fields. So we can expose them to the inspector without making them public. And we can go further on later down the road and then do the same thing for here. And then when it builds, our player now has our health and the enemy has its health. So, yeah, this is just warnings about stuff that's not assigned, but it's never used. Right now, these values are assigned, but they're not used. Basically, all it's saying is, hey, you got variables that aren't driving any functionality. That's expected. That's normal. It's fine. So, how do we have our player attack our mob? We've got to create a controller. Like I said before, this information, if I were to pull it from a database and load it up on the screen right now, I'd know all the information about the game to continue playing as normal. However, we need actual functionality. So now we're going to create an attack. So player attack. What's going to happen when the player attacks? Well, it's going to damage the enemy. Here's where that event manager comes into play. I could have, every time my player clicks or something like that, every single time they click, the player has to go reference an enemy or go find the game object and deal damage to it, or I could have it drag and drop via the inspector. However, that creates a direct dependency on the enemy. What if there's no enemy in the scene? I shouldn't have to turn off my player attack script. You know, my player can still attack. There's just no enemy there. So what we actually want to do is we want to abstract it using that event manager. So we're going to create the update cycle, and every update we're going to listen to an input. So input.get mouse button, or get mouse button down. So if I've clicked, we're going to listen to the first mouse button. We can change this to, let's do, I forget what the actual compile specific Unity platform dependent compilation. I'm going to make this specifically just for when it's a PC or a Mac. So at least we're listening for, let's see, Unity Windows. We'll just do Unity standalone Windows, or, well, you know what, actually we're just going to worry about it in the sense that it's mobile. So not iOS. So if not? Compile specific. Sorry, I don't actually remember this language. If not. Preprocessor directive. How do I do an if not? It is exclamation mark. So if not Unity iOS, or it's and not Unity Android. Then we can do an end if. So what I'm doing here is I'm creating something that's called a platform dependent directive. So I'm saying that if the game is currently not being run on an iOS or an Android, we're going to listen to the mouse. There's probably scenarios where they're playing it on a tablet or they're playing it on a console that's not going to fall in there. But for now, we're going to build this game so that it's going to run on either a PC or an iPhone. Right now, we're going to design it for PC, but we want to have these platform-specific directives so that later on, when I swap the platform, I can see that there's functionality that I needed to implement. So if mouse button's down, we want our player to attack. How do we do this? Event manager. Well, public event action. Is that not correct? No, it is correct. I just need to use system. And then on player attack. The question is, do we want to pass the player's attack for this one? For now, we're going to say yes. So what this means is, this is now a subscribable action on our event manager that anything can listen to. So right now we've got this on player attack action. We don't want our player to call that event directly. We want them to call a method. So we're going to create player attack int damage. So then on player attack, if it exists and has listeners, we're going to invoke it with the damage as the input. So what this says is, if I call player attack from outside of my scripts here with the damage input as one of the parameters, it will then invoke the event on player attack and tell anybody listening to trigger their listened methods. So, oh, he's so cute, he's sleeping over there. So in our player attack method, we're just going to call event manager. We're going to have to use Eric Overflow, or we can namespace this whole thing into Eric Overflow. We don't need to use it then. Event manager dot instance dot player attack. And the player attack is going to have information about the player. So now we're going to have a reference configured in the inspector. Player info dot attack. Oh, hey, we can't get the attack right now. How do we fix that? Remember, this is currently a private field, so we can't expose it directly. However, what we can do is encapsulate it using we can right click and call quick actions refactoring and encapsulate, or you can type it out like this. This is creating a property out of it. We don't want to allow other methods to directly impact the attack damage this way. This is just to get the attack damage out. So we're just going to call player info dot attack damage. And now, anytime the player attacks, it will call the event manager and trigger that attack damage script that will let the listeners know. So now the mob info. How do we have the mob info take damage? Well, the health is controlled, or the health is visible in the mob's info script. However, we want to have a health controller or a life controller or a general mob controller. What do we call this? Maybe we'll call this the health controller. So we're going to create a new script called the mob health controller. Similar process here, only the difference is we're not going to be listening to any inputs from the input system. We're going to be listening for anything on the event manager. So in here, we're going to need to, again, include the namespace Eric Overflow. And if you wanted to name your own namespace, you could. And here, instead of calling the stuff in update, we're going to say event manager.instance.onPlayerAttacks, and we're going to create a script called take damage. And what does this do? This basically says anytime that on-player attack event is triggered, this is going to call its internal method take damage. This is going to be damage amount, or we'll just change it to amount. And here, this is going to have to affect the mob info. So we're going to create a serialized field, mob info. And when damage gets taken, we're going to want to take the health, and we're going to subtract some health from it. Now, there's a couple of patterns we can do here. We can treat this as strictly data directly visible to other scripts, and if somebody wants to change the data, they can change it directly. However, I advise against that because even though this is supposed to act as a visible, this is information about the game at the moment, because we want to potentially have a serialization or database behind there, this should act as that trigger. So if something changes on this script, we want to say to the event manager, hey, health changed, or hey, this character died, or loot was picked up. And so we might want to potentially expose these using fields or using methods. So here, when this takes damage, we want to call mobinfo.takeDamage, or we want to call mobinfo.health and change it. Let's actually just say void change health int new health. And so what this is going to do is going to say health equals new health. Now there's a couple things here. One, if we were to create a new mob or spawn it, this allows us to call change health and spawn it with a different amount of health. Two, it also allows us to say event manager. We got to use the correct namespace, Eric Overflow. And it also lets us to tell the event manager if there was an event to listen to, say, hey, mob health change. And we could potentially trigger something like an animation or a noise that comes off. This is probably too generic for us to do that. However, this now allows us to directly say mobinfo.changeHealth. Is that not public? It's not public. Change health. And the amount will be the current amount of health. We want to expose that using encapsulated fields. Remove that set so you can't modify it directly. And we're going to say mobinfo.health minus amount. We'll change this to damage amount. I hit Control and then R twice while holding down the Control button to be able to refactor this. So damage amount. And so now, whenever my character or my player attacks, my player attack controller will then trigger the event manager for player attack. My event manager will trigger off anything that's listening to on player attack and invoke it with the damage parameter involved. My mob health controller is listening to that, so it will take that damage amount and insert it into this method, and it'll call mobinfo.changeHealth, mobinfo minus health. And so now, if we actually go and play it, we should be able to see. The question is, do I need to recompile? I think I need to recompile first. I don't have my environment set to auto-compile because I was working with Firebase in the past, and that really slows down the ability for Unity to auto-compile. So now whenever I click, I should see that the enemy's health takes some damage. And it's not. Why is it not taking damage? Ah, well, of course. I have no idea. Oh, because I have the scripts attached to it. So we need to attach our player attack to the player and our mob health controller to the mob. And we're going to go ahead and just drag the reference to the script here and drag the reference to the script here. We could also, of course, put it in the way you can use a get component. Now there's something important here. This may or may not work, and we'll find out here in a second. If it doesn't work, that's okay. I'll show you why. Look at this. We get a no reference exception. What is that? I'm going to bet it's on this subscription. Yep, the event manager. So what happened here? Well, as you notice, the event manager exists. However, instance isn't set yet until awake. It looks like here our mob health controller is calling awake before our event manager is. So what's happening is this is actually null. How do we fix this? Well, there's a couple ways you can do this. You can build your own script execution method that everything goes through and is controlled. That's overkill, and I've seen a lot of developers do that. Unity actually provides its own script execution order control here that we can go ahead and modify. So here, right now, these 4 scripts run before the default time. I want my event manager to run before the default time as well, because usually my event manager needs to be set up before my other scripts. And so if we do this, we apply it and we run it now. Nope, I have to recompile probably. What is this? On player attack. Player info. Is that not configured properly? I've got to look into this. So player info is not defined. Object not set to an instance of an object. Player info. It is set to an instance of an object. Well, let's go ahead and step through this and see what's wrong. So that apparently is also still not set yet. Event manager instance is not, you know what? I don't have an event manager attached to anything. That's why I feel silly. Done. Alright, now let's try this one last time. Now if we look at our enemy, whenever we click, his health goes down. Of course his health can go below 0 because we haven't set up any gating or anything like that. But we've gotten to the point where we have an attack that our player can attack the enemy. We can do the same thing to reverse the enemy can attack our player. But I think this has been enough of a painful experience for you to watch me develop that I'm going to set this for another time, or I'll continue this later. But thanks for watching. If there's anything you have questions about here, I hope this wasn't too much word vomit for you. I know there's a couple of snafus where I don't get exactly everything right, or I have to debug, but maybe that's helpful to you if you wanted to see some debugging. But this is just some best practices, some setting up our game for success here to be able to develop it going forward. We'll continue this in another video. Thanks for watching.